r/NoSleep. Posted by u/womaclium77. I worked residential care and found incident reports that mentioned a knocking. Then I started hearing it. I used to work in residential care with individuals that would engage in crisis behaviors. I worked night shift, during the day, and what felt like all hours between. For the most part it was a really good job. I almost never got freaked out, and when I did, it would pass. There were a few nights that strange things started to happen. Lights randomly shutting off, strange noises outside, other creepy stuff that all night shift workers have experienced. This career led to others, and it has been a long time since I have thought about the incident reports. It all started with an audit by the state. I had been awake all night, and right as my shift was about to end, the state auditor showed up. Coffee hungover and red-eyed, I showed them the fire alarms, medication storage and all documentation the state requires to operate a facility. My boss was an hour out when I showed them what we called the dreaded drawer. This is a drawer packed with incident reports from before we digitized them. With lack of a scanner, funds, and time, we never organized the reports. The state auditor turned their head towards me and asked simply, "Are you joking?" The lack of organization put a stain on the rest of the visit. By the time the man in the floral pattern button-up and beige slacks left, I had felt sick to my stomach. When my boss finally showed up to work, I got chewed out. My boss wanted me to stall until he got there so he could have talked his way out of any trouble we would gotten in. He is delusional. The state didn't care what he had to say. Regardless of reason, I was in hot water. They gave us 90 days to fix the errors. The higher-ups at work were pissed and assigned me to personally go through the dreaded drawer and organize them digitally. They laughed when I brought up a scanner. Every overnight shift I worked for weeks was filled with 8 hours of manually entering the reports onto a blank document and organizing them into files by client. One of the things the state brought up about the dreaded drawer was the simple fact that any incident report could have been about any given client from 2010 to 2015. If we were asked to provide all incident reports on, say, Larry Smith, there would be no way to accurately collect all of them. Larry Smith was the example name the auditor gave me in the scenario. I thought it lacked creativity. So instead of shelling out money for a scanner, my boss thought a good punishment would be having me type out every single incident report from those 5 years while I was on shift. He called it my punishment for not handling the state auditor correctly, but I knew he just didn't want to do it. Pretty sure the technical term for my position was the fall guy. Working night shift sucks. Anytime from 3 a.m. to 5 a.m. turns minutes into years. Staring at a cheap laptop, hand typing every word written over the course of 5 years added to the life-draining effect of the shift. I don't think I have conveyed how truly endless this drawer was. For one, the drawer was 5 feet wide, 2 feet deep and a foot tall. It was attached to a massive cabinet we typically use to lock extra medications in. There's a lot of individual papers that can fit in a space like that, especially when it is overflowing. The minutes ticked by and there I sat, night after night typing. Occasionally clients would wake up and ask me to cook them something or threaten to leave the program. I would try and help out but would always promptly return to the reports. Most of the times I wouldn't focus on the words I was typing. I got really good at quickly reading the report and typing out everything without even realizing what I was reading. At least it was like that, until on one particular shift, it wasn't. I want to share with you the first incident report that snapped me out of my autopilot. For HIPAA reasons, this client's name has been changed to John Smith, much more creative than Larry, I might add. November 20, 2013. Verbal aggression, self-harm. At approximately 3:15 a.m. on November 20, 2013, staff member Deidre Ryan was in the living room of the facility. Deidre auditorily observed a knocking on the roof. Client, John Smith, exited his room and began repeating, "It's here, it's here, it's here." Deidre initiated verbal interventions to attempt to assist client in relaxing to go back to sleep. John began engaging in verbal aggression. Deidre assured client he was safe and encouraged coping skills as listed on John's crisis plan. John began grabbing his own hair and pulling. Deidre observed a large amount of hair in John's closed right hand. Deidre continued verbal intervention. This caused no change in behavior. John escalated and began banging his head against the hallway walls. Deidre attempted to buffer with a pillow, in an attempt to stop client from self-harm. Client grabbed the pillow and screamed at staff, "Why can't you fucking hear it?" Staff assured client that she could hear the knocking on the roof and was sure everything was okay. From 3:15 am 4 am client continued engaging in self-harm behaviors. Staff attempted verbal interventions throughout the incident. Physical interventions were not an option, as staff was alone. Client was observed engaging in deep breathing around 4 a.m. and went back to sleep quickly. Client appeared to be exhausted. Client has not engaged in any further aggression or self-harm. Property damage consists of 4 holes 4 to 6 inches in diameter in the drywall in the hallway. A work order has been submitted. Staff will follow up with client's primary doctor to further assess medication and any injuries sustained during the incident. Signed, Deidre Ryan. This specific incident report broke my haze because as I was typing it into the computer, I began hearing knocking on the roof. Once I paid attention to it, it abruptly stopped, then quickly started again. There's a skylight carved in the middle of the facility hallway. It sounded like the knocking was isolated to that. When I went to inspect, all I could see was my own reflection in the glass, staring directly at the ceiling. Another knocking was heard in the living room, what sounded like on the sliding glass door. When I went to inspect, I couldn't see or hear anything. One of my client's voices behind me made me jump and gasp. "What was that?" Dave asked me. I know the name Dave is uncreative, but you know, HIPAA. "It's nothing, go back to bed," I responded. Dave went to his room and was quiet the rest of the night, and I went back to typing and organizing the reports. A few nights later, I pulled another report. November 24, 2013. Verbal threats, physical aggression towards staff, self-harm, law enforcement contact. At approximately 3:15 a.m. on November 24, 2013, client, John Smith exited his room and began barking at the skylight in the facility hallway. Staff member, Deidre Ryan, reminded client others were sleeping in the facility and he needed to keep his voice down. Deidre attempted to encourage client to take deep breaths, as this is something that has helped with past behaviors. Client looked at staff and said in a loud voice, "You're going to die tonight." Client then charged at Deidre. Client grabbed Deidre's hair and pulled her to the ground. Staff attempted physical interventions to avoid further physical harm. Client overpowered staff, pinning her to the ground. Client struck staff with closed fists repeatedly. Client was observed screaming, "Why can't you see him?" during the attack. Staff attempted further physical intervention with no ability to escape. Client jumped off of staff and stared into the skylight. Client began screaming, "Go away," while looking up repeatedly. Staff member, Deidre Ryan, called emergency services at approximately 3:27 a.m., as all other interventions had been exhausted. Facility manager follow-up, Deidre Ryan has been placed on medical leave for a fracture of her skull. Client has been assessed for injury and a follow-up appointment has been made with client's primary care doctor. Client had open wounds on his knuckles from the strikes. Aside from the wounds on his knuckles, no further injuries were observed. Staff, Deidre did report as she was being struck repeatedly, she observed what looked like the silhouette of a man above the skylight. Deidre was the only staff in the building, and there is no way to confirm any persons were on the roof. Facility cameras have been installed outside to avoid any potential break-ins. I felt gross typing this incident report. Staff getting injured wasn't uncommon, but as I was typing, the knocking started. I ignored it until I finished documenting the report and putting it into the correct folder. I checked the time on the laptop, 3:15 a.m. Suddenly my attention was ripped from the computer when my client Dave screamed out, "What the fuck is that?" I turned quickly and saw Dave under the skylight, staring directly up. I jumped into action and ran to him to give comfort. The knocking grew louder as Dave's roommate, Bob, exited his room, staring at the skylight. Both of them grabbed each other and began screaming at the top of their lungs. It rattled me. I felt the hairs on my neck stand up and I was cold immediately. That's the worst part about working as a caretaker, you have to be the adult in the situation, regardless of the situation. Even when you feel like a child in terror and want to run. I began to say, "It's okay boys," and I couldn't help it. I looked up. I see the reflection of the three of us in the skylight. Between the three of us in the reflection, was a man without eyes slowly knocking with his right hand. He was licking the glass with a long tongue that was far too thin. His hunched over body was barely visible but his face was clearly there. I'll never forget the holes where his eyes were supposed to be. The dark against the glass reflection seemed endless. "There's a man on the roof," I whispered to myself. That's when I realized this figure had to be about 8 feet tall. He was bunched up, scrawny and bony, but his height was obvious. The clients continued screaming, deafening my ears. I grabbed them and rushed into a room. I told them to hide under the covers. When I went back out to the skylight, he was gone. Right as I was squinting at the skylight, the knocking was heard on the sliding glass door. I ran out and I saw him against my own reflection. I was standing alone in the middle of the living room, completely lit up by the facility lights. Then I wasn't. The lights shut off. 8 feet tall was an accurate guess. The sheer height of this thing was shocking. He had his long arms dangling to his sides, and with the back of his hand he continued knocking. He stared at me with those holes in his face. He smiled. One hand continued knocking while the other waved slowly. Then he crumpled down on all fours and moved with speed I've only seen during a documentary on cheetahs. He didn't move like a cheetah, he moved like an insect. He disappeared into the night. I checked on my clients and assured them everything was okay, and he was gone. The next day I walked out, and I never went back. That was 7 years ago. Since then, I've moved to an entirely different state and have forgotten about the incident reports. I did, until I didn't. Last night at 3:15 a.m., my dogs started barking madly at our sliding glass door. I got up to check and nothing was there. I told my dog to leave it and I went back to bed. We have neighborhood cats that drive my dog insane sometimes. I was starting to fade out and my heart stopped pounding. My dog continued to growl, and I tried to comfort him. My dog then made a whining noise I've only heard when he was in pain and my eyes shot open. I started to hear the knocking again.